And yeah, I'm gonna get started. My name is Chaz Briscoe. And hello, everyone. I am the organizer of this roundtable. I am a fourth-year graduate student at the University of California, Irvine. And so I just want to thank you all for taking your time to attend this session. If you are here for Saving the World for Everyone, Women of Color, Organizing Environmental Justice and Climate Justice Roundtable, you are in the correct place. As with most conferences, the ideas I proposed have shifted from the fall a little bit. However, I assure you, you're in for an amazing discussion around community engagement, environmental and climate justice, and the political governance structures the movement faces. The three panelists I will introduce shortly are respected activists and organizers within and outside of academia. And so I wanted to mention that at the end of this, when we have a little bit of time, at the end of the roundtable, we will have a little bit of space for questions and answers. And so I will be the one monitoring the chat simply drop your questions into the chat. And if time allows, the panelists will provide their thoughts and feedback. Okay, cool. And so before I introduce the panelists, I just want to say this morning, I learned that I lost a dear family friend. And so before we begin, I just want to offer time for a collective breath, just to kind of share with everyone. I want to thank INCOPES for having us in this virtual space. And so if it's not, too much to ask, I would like to dedicate this roundtable to all the mentors, all the people who make people feel seen and acknowledged and valued in this world. And so, yeah, I'd like to now get started. First, we have Dr. Shafi. Dr. Shafi is an associate professor and chair of the Department of Political Science and co-chair of the Sustainable Spelman Committee. Dr. Shafi is a member of the United States Environmental Protection Agency's National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. She has served as an environmental justice consultant for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and she was a member of the Academic Advisory Board for the annual editions of Sustainability, which was published by McGraw-Hill Higher Education Contemporary Learning Series. Dr. Shafi has served as a project director, co-project director, and partnership leader on numerous federal grants from the U.S. EPA, or Environmental Protection Agency, and Department of Energy. In addition, she has served as a project director for grants for UNCF and Mellon. Dr. Shafi has been an expert and leader in advancing integration of sustainability into college, university, high school, and middle school curricula for more than 2 decades. To advance education for sustainability, she has planned, developed, and conducted numerous workshops and institutes for college and university faculty, and for high school and middle school teachers. In addition, Dr. Shafi has received funding for her research in the environmental policy area for the Environmental Policy and Innovation Grant, Emergency Planning and Preparedness. Dr. Shafi is very passionate about addressing environmental justice and has organized and led a broad spectrum of advocacy and educational projects. The many projects she has hosted and directed include Toxic Release Inventory Regional Workshop, Reimagining the 21st Century through Advancing Education for Sustainability, and the Atlanta Environmental Summit, Linking Priorities from a Minority Perspective. Next, I will introduce our panelist, Michelle Roberts. For over 30 years, Ms. Roberts has provided capacity support and technical assistance on the connections between chemical management, oil and gas extraction, and energy systems, all which now have a monumental legacy impact on the global climate crisis. She supports communities in their efforts to make connections regarding the impacts of toxins on human health and the environment. She is also a spoken word artist who created a community-based arts program created to advance social justice. Roberts is also an environmental justice and environmental producer on Washington, D.C.'s Pacifica Radio 89.3 FM, on-the-ground show, Voices of Resistance. She proclaims herself as a proud graduate of the historically Black college and university family. Prior to being an advocate, Michelle worked as an environmental scientist in the government. She currently serves as the national co-coordinator of a national collaborative known as the Environmental Justice and Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform. Her advocacy has been featured in many media spaces. She's co-authored many environmental justice-rooted demographic analysis with communities. She participated in the United Nations Conference on the Status of Women 63 as a delegate member presiding Bishop Michael Curry of the National Episcopal Church, as well as many of the United Nations Conference of the parties' climate negotiations. And she has played an integral role on behalf of the works of EGHN in the drafting of the Historical Equitable Justice and Equitable and Justice National Climate Platform. And finally, we have our final panelist, the Honorable Harold Mitchell Jr. The Honorable Harold Mitchell Jr. is a former Democratic member of the South Carolina House of Representatives, representing the 31st District from 2005 to 2017. Mr. Mitchell is currently the Executive Director of Regenesis. In 1999, Mr. Mitchell had the honor of building his EJ Foundation by serving on the Executive Council of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council and the Waste and Facilities Siting Subcommittee. In 1999 to 2014, Mr. Mitchell led and managed the role of the nonprofits, starting the Superfund cleanup of the IMC fertilizer plant's deconstruction, the Arkwright landfill remediation capping site. In 2004, led the state's first voluntary cleanup contract of the Arkwright textile mill brownfield site, a petroleum and the hazardous waste cleanup of the North Street dump brownfield site. In 2009, Mr. Mitchell formed an LLC and contracted with the Spartanburg County to lead the demolition, remediation, cleanup, and community engagement of the Victor Mill brownfield site in Greer, South Carolina. After collaborating with 8 federal agencies, Regenesis has become the demonstration project for the Federal Interagency Working Group on Environmental Justice. Please welcome our distinguished guests. So just to get started, I will throw to Dr. Shafi with our first question. And so just for each of you, I would like for each of you to take some time and take a moment to then introduce yourselves beyond the bio that I provided. How did you get started in the environmental justice and climate justice movement? And like I said, we'll start with Dr. Shafi. You have to unmute yourself, sorry.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us and sharing your afternoon with us. I hope at the end you would get something out of this panel. And I know that you will get something out of Honorable Harold Mitchell and distinguished Michelle Roberts, but I try to also contribute. How did I get involved? When I was a graduate student, the Union Carbide tragedy, disaster, or as the company calls it, accident, which I call disaster, happened. And to this day, the disaster is infamous for being the worst industrial accident in the world. The reason I don't call it an accident is because companies audit previously predicted that failure to correct the problems that were raised in the audit would potentially lead to the runaway reaction, which did on that fateful night, and would cause problem. Of course, none of the company's own safety audit recommendations were implemented or addressed. So on December 22 at night and continue to December 3rd, 84, thousands perished that night. And almost all of the victims were poor people who were living in the shanty towns adjacent to the plant. And to this day, believe it or not, we still don't know the composition of the gas that was released that night, the toxic gas, because company kept dodging the question, hiding behind trademark. So we still don't know what really got out, but what we know is that people were running, and they were gasping for air and suffocating and dying on the street as they were fleeing the toxic gas. And there was a journalist that night in Bhopal who had taken pictures, and you could see the buildings were intact, but then the people were dead all over in the street, the birds, the uh, cats, dogs, the whole, I think the photos that came out uh, defies any kind of horror movies that we could ever imagine. However, one thing was that the rich people were not that much affected. They hopped on their cars and left town, and they only returned the next day after all of the gas had been uh, dispersed. And the Bhopal plant had many problems, design problems, maintenance problem, safety violation problems. People have died in that plant before, but the nepotism between the government of India and the Union Carbide really prevented from a many meaningful accountability on the part of the company. And when I was doing my dissertation, so I decided to do my dissertation on the case study of Union Carbide. I found out that there was a sister plant in United States, identical plant in the Institute, West Virginia, and guess who are living in that neighborhood? Blacks also, community, Black community were living around that plant. And when Carbide was asked by US official whether this could happen in the Institute plant, Carbide denied it and said, no, 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 our technology is safe. And Bhopal disaster was an act of sabotage by a disgruntled worker. But not long, in August 1985, which was less than 9 months after the Bhopal, there was a toxic gas release at the Institute plant that meant that sent hundreds of people, mostly Black and low income people who were living next to the plant, to the hospital. And so, to make this story short, is that my dissertation concluded that environmental degradation follows the path of least resistance, and communities of color and low-wealth communities are most vulnerable to assault on their environment. And this conclusion, which I wrote in 1990, dissertation, has now been validated by many studies that have been conducted by researchers and scholars in the United States and beyond. And so after I did my dissertation, during that time, I found that fighting environmental racism was my calling, and I have been involved in the quest for environmental justice ever since. And I am sorry to say, but most EJ academics were disrespected, and they were labeled as activists and not serious scholars. And so public scholarship was really shunned and dismissed. And now time may be changing, and I'm hoping that it it's not going to be a momentary change, but more long-lasting change in the academia and their recognition that some of these studies are more scholarly than they ever imagined. Thank you. I yield.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Shafi. Um, Michelle Roberts, you can go next. You can tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got involved, and tell us a little bit about Morgan State, and then yeah, how you got involved in the environmental justice movement.
Sure. Thank you very much. And I want to give a personal shout out to the National Black Conference of Political Scientists. It is an esteemed honor to participate in this process. Education is, as you asked that question, I was thinking about the importance of education, the importance of Black teachers, the importance of scholarship that comes from our communities. All of that is what actually brought me into this work. I wish to say on a spiritual journey, um, because in in 1968, in second grade, was when Dr. King was assassinated, and I was in second grade. I had a teacher by the name of Mrs. Catherine Ross, and Mrs. Catherine B. Ross was an exceptional woman, very awesome political force, educator, and she was an accomplished singer. She wanted to be an opera singer, but was not, in those days, she wasn't going to be an opera singer, right? And Mrs. Ross, I recall when we didn't have school for weeks. And I've been recently asking people, like, how many weeks did we not have school then? Because, cities were burning. My city of Wilmington, Delaware, where I'm originally from and where I am right now currently with my family, we were the longest occupied city in the nation. What many fail to realize, we were occupied by the National Guard. We were under martial law. As I learned as an 8-year old what martial law meant, whereby we were under martial law for 9 months, um, legally, if you will, but literally the National Guard patrolled our streets for up to 2 years almost. My father's very dear friend and our family priest to this day still has the card, where as a priest, as a Black priest, he was allowed to be out after dark or after the time frame, right? And so fast forwarding on, we learned that we had to make our communities better. That was what my second grade teacher taught. But I equally came out of a school system. There's a lot of history in the great state of Delaware. My parents were part of the 1954 class of Howard High School. And Howard High School was the only Black high school in the state. It's my understanding that students would come. Many people in Delaware say, "Oh, everyone knows one another." Well, we do because of what happened with racial segregation in education. And so my parents were part of the 1954 class, that historic 54 class. Delaware was a plaintiff state that at that particular time. You may hear that now President Biden speak to his understanding of pollution in the area that he grew up in Claymont, Delaware. Equally, the history that many people don't recognize and realize is that the actual student whose family was part of the Brown v. Board, Ms. Louise Belton, she equally lived in that Claymont community that Biden grew up in. And but she was not allowed to get on the school bus to go to the school close to her home. She had to travel down to Wilmington and get there the best way she could, right? And this woman had a heart condition. um, all of these things are very important, because then it fast forwarding into my uh, going to Morgan State University, the no disrespect, Dr. Shafi, but the best HBCU in the whole global society. And it was because of, and this is where, again, education is so important, and why today this gives me great joy to be part of this roundtable, because I started Morgan State University as a political science major, but I was always interested in science. But I didn't really want to. I had no interest in forwarding a career in science at that particular time, interestingly enough, because the science mechanism in my world was the DuPont company. And I considered, like a lot of the things that, unfortunately, because of those times, when we looked at the political time, there was a lot of racism, and there still is a lot of racism today. But there was a great deal of racism that that ran rampant through, in my opinion, the DuPont company. Their practices, how they treated their employees, and even more so, how they treated communities where they were located. Um, I did not know what I could do with a science degree, other than go to medical school, and I had no interest in attending medical school. But while at Morgan, I had an exceptional opportunity while studying political science. I had this science teacher that just kept after me at Morgan about switching over into the science department. And just very quickly, I learned that about this thing called environmental science, but it was very new then. People were not really engaging. And so I was afforded an opportunity with the Army Corps of Engineers. And there I learned about wetlands biology. And there I learned how the importance of plants and soils and water and the earth, and how it was important to the evolution of our communities. I even learned how some of these plants were important to our health, if you will. And so, just fast forwarding on, I wound up eventually switching my major at Morgan over to biology, and I graduated with a degree in biology, and I minored in chemistry. But thanks to Dr. Dr. Rosalind Turborg Penn. May she rest in peace. She was a new professor then at Morgan, and she saw to it that I continued to read articles and learn political theories, if you will. And so today, I now make those intersections while working as an environmental scientist. Just quickly, I worked as an environmental scientist and was able to witness how the government and industries seem to have a relationship that the communities where these industries were located had no relationship. And not only did the communities have no relationship with these industries, they equally did not have relationship with the government. And it created deep challenges for me as I worked as an environmental scientist. By that point, I was back in Delaware and had graduated from Morgan, and was now working in toxics. Just last, I worked the entire scope of water, from wastewater to drinking water and tidal water. But I saw the connections and the interconnections, and equally the disparities that impacted our communities very early on, before this whole concept and construct of environmental justice came to be. So by the time environmental justice came online at this particular point, people in my own sphere, my own family, and my circle and families and communities, those people who lived in those segregated communities that my parents were friends with, that I grew up with my whole life, started now going away from me quickly through illnesses and deaths. So I'll stop there, but that is how it all really came together for me, with respect to environmental justice and environmental racism.
Mm, beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing. I'm gonna throw over to the Honorable Harold Mitchell. If you wanna kind of give us, yeah, a similar introduction.
Well, thank you, and thank you to Michelle and Dr. Shafi, and to you, Chaz, and condolences to you as well. But my getting involved in understanding the terminology of environmental justice, um, I had no idea that there was even such a term growing up um, in the two Superfund sites, four brownfield sites that I found out later. But growing up, that was home. Running through the piles of raw materials of the fertilizer at the site, playing around the waste ponds. I used to go to school telling people I lived near the lake, but I didn't tell them that it was a waste pond. It was green from the acid there at that facility. I mean, I was proud of my little green lake there, not knowing until later the impacts. But later on, I ended up with a illness that was undiagnosed um, after in school and lost about 30 pounds. Um, Doctors couldn't determine exactly what was going on. The entire left side was swollen. Um, and people were basically coming to my grandmother's house looking at me as if I was a corpse, dying there. Didn't pay any attention to any of this until there was, and I'll quickly fast go through this, Chaz, that there was a message that T.D. Jakes ministered during that time of illness that um, he ministered on stewardship and talked about all the things that we had dropped the ball on in society. And he said, if we could just go back and regenerate the moment, and that stuck with me. And it also put something in me as to how to get involved, wanting to get involved. And that next morning when I got up, because usually, when I get up, it's almost like a toothache, how that pain shoots through the body. And so that morning I got up and I didn't have that pain. But when I went outside, I looked at this fertilizer plant for the first time with a different lens. You know, this thing about making a difference in your community and just remembering Bishop Jake saying, start at your front door. And when I looked across the street and what I saw in the front door was an abandoned site that kids would come play in and out, all the drug activity because it was a dead end street. And so it was like, not thinking about anything environmentally, but just from an incubator of criminal activity that I could see there in South Carolina, you know, tags with cards from North Carolina and Georgia with the trunks up, but they were back then, in the mid 90s, the Lexuses that everybody was trying to get. So it's like, okay, a dead end street that there's no visibility, but you see these like, you know, 15, $20,000 rims on the Lexus and these little brothers with the trunks up. It's like, you knew what was going on. And so my thing was trying to get the local environmental office to address, the problems of closing the place up. And so I ended up at the local office, which I was given the files by mistake. The lady thought that I was coming in to review the Freedom of Information Act. She's like, you're here for the FOIA. I thought FOIA was a person. So I tried to pretend like I knew what I was talking about. And she gave me the files and it's like, you want me to make copies? And I was like, yeah. When I get through, make the copies. Well, I went in and started going through these files. And it was like a slap in the face when I saw growing up that it was harmless fertilizer that you put on your, growing things in the yards. And then I started looking at all this toxic waste, hazardous waste, and thinking, did this make me sick? And as I'm flipping through, I'm seeing all these things that, that we were told that it was just harmless fertilizer. And so I took all of that and begin to, look, number one, I was the only person that ever reviewed the files at this site. And so looking at some of the pictures, I used to walk around with the night watchman, and what was in that file and what I saw listed as a clean closure. This was in 1994. It closed in 1986, but it stated it was a clean closure. And, through this whole thing, I didn't know anything about any of that, but um, I was visited by a guy from the South Carolina militia at the apartment that told me waste was big business. And what was I doing? Did I understand that this is he's like, you don't understand what you're really dealing with. But he gave me the number to EPA. I called EPA the next day, and I was told that this was an operational textile storage warehouse, and got into it with this lady for a while about the conditions of this fertilizer plant. And then later on, my dad ended up with the same illness that I had. And it turns out that it was lymphoma. He was diagnosed with lymphoma cancer and died 1997, New Year's Day. But before that, I took those documents that I received and looked at the raw materials, because I never believed how my sister died. And so I took the raw materials and took her death certificate, and I went to this corner in the neighboring county. That neighboring county, they told me the sepsis omphallitis is a germ poisoning that your mother, while pregnant, if she was around whatever, breathing or smoking, this is what would happen. And so didn't tell him what it was, but I looked back in the short-term, long-term exposures, and I saw that. Then I saw my mom's sister's daughter died the exact same way. 2 doors down, a kid died the exact same way. And then I'm starting to think, it's like, well, looking at everybody on the street, nobody died of natural causes. It was either lung cancer or a rare respiratory problem, but there was no such thing that he died of natural causes. I go a street behind me, and that's where, one house, 6 sisters who all worked in the educational system or in the schools, all had miscarriages. There were 10 miscarriages in that house. Then I begin to see that, we have a high infant mortality in this community. And so to speed it up, sir, ended up organizing both the low-income African-American community, a low-income white mill village, and the other community that was across the track, which was in the city limits, who people that worked not in the factory like everybody in the Arkwright community, because no one ever talked to one another. And it was at a meeting, that the first meeting I pulled everybody together after my dad's funeral. People came to this particular meeting after dealing with EPA and DHEC about the sites. And one lady got up and said, hey, after everybody started telling all these different stories about what they buried and what they did in the operations at the plant, one lady said, well, my doctor told me that 1 out of 2 to 300 women would have what I have with the deterioration of the cartilage in my nose because of the emissions. Well, across the street, the lady said, well, my doctor told me that. Then 2 doors down, another lady said the exact same thing. So 3 women in a meeting that you could throw a rock at each one of the houses were told 1 out of 300 people would have what they got. And the light bulb started going off in there. Then that's when we saw that the landfill that didn't exist, according to the city, who was an owner, operator, transporter, was where the EPA repository showed in one instance in the investigation that a couple who used to drive on Sundays dumping out the waste, well, the hospital didn't incinerate the waste. And what was in that barrel that they looked at that morning was fetuses and amputated limbs. So this is what was dumped. Fence line of the communities is less than 75 feet from where people's drinking water wells were located. And so even when this was put into the community in 1958, they shut down in 1973, but they got it listed as 72, but I know it's 73 because I saw Main Street Mall sidewalk with 1973 in it that was in there. But all of this, in 2002 is when when they ended up putting folks on emergency hookups, because they tested the landfill during that time, and it was the exact same thing that was in these wells that people were drinking. So in organizing the community and with this big pushback, because the city was an operator, owner of that landfill, and always telling folks that, those folks over there, they're making these things up. It was not a makeup. So when we organized and pulled everything together, we elected our vice chair of the organization, the city council, because at that time it was the pointing fingers and what I was able to see at NEJAC and how everyone was looking through the lens of pollution and EPA and all these problems we had around the access to healthcare, the housing conditions, crime, all these things that you see around these abandoned facilities had impacted us. Is where, I used to go to back and forth to DC at the NEJAC, and I would go to some of these other meetings and I would hear after President Clinton signed the executive order what other agencies were doing. And so it's like, wait a minute, why am I hearing people over here talk about healthcare at EPA at an EPA meeting, and HHS is having a meeting over here talking about that? Why am I hearing DOT talking about this, but people over here talking about transportation issues at an EJ meeting? And so I began working with some of those agencies. And when they started with this demonstration project, we were one of the 11 demonstration projects with the Federal Interagency Working Group in 2000. So we got a $20,000 small grant to build capacity and the coalition of our folks locally. And we leveraged that 20,000 into close to $300 million, to where we took a medically underserved area and got our, with Texas Southern University, the students coming in helping us, that data we used got us the top grant award. So we went from a medically underserved area to 9 federally qualified health centers that we service to a $19 million economic impact. And we begin to do the exact same thing with our housing and other things within that community. So, out of that, Chaz, I know I'm well past over my time. I was waiting for Michelle to finger up, but it's just, after that, and all of this, I was not an elected official. I was a grassroots organizer at that point. Because people say, oh, they got that 300 million because he was a grassroots, an elected official. And that's far from the truth, because I hated elected officials back then. Didn't want to get into it, but I saw that the person that actually was going to take that seat was going to end up screwing us up big time. But I got in the legislature, and that's where this whole thing of peer-to-peer and working with people across the country. Richard Moore from the Southwest Network told me about an environmental justice bill that was passed in New Mexico. And so I was like, okay, let me try this here. We passed that environmental justice bill in South Carolina in a red state. It went without reference. And the co-signers on my bill was Nikki Haley, Mick Mulvaney, the chief of staff for the previous president, and members of the Freedom Caucus. They passed that environmental justice bill because they saw the economic impact. And out of that, that's when I ended up meeting Michelle and other folks, because if we start to work with the other coalitions and people that can bring things to us, I want to be around people that, those smart folks that make you think and exercise that brain power. But we took that landfill, it's capped now. The city, we held them accountable for it, $11 million, but we're converting that landfill now into a solar farm. And when I was in the legislature, created a tax credit for renewable energy projects such as solar and geothermal. And Senator Clemente Pinckney was my person from the Senate we had that was a part of that bill that got out, 2 weeks before the Mother Emanuel massacre. And so, in that, what we've tried to do is reach out and help other communities with the methodology of being able to take and be the stakeholder at the table, driving this process of ownership and capacity within the community. So, I'm sorry for taking the time, but I'm a retired legislator. And
you're all good.
I'm just going on and on. And it's like, God damn, they're like, hey.
And so, what I'm gonna do is just kind of wrap us together, just because, I saw Jamie's comment in the chat. All politics are local. And I really do think that's what you all's stories give us, as you talk about looking out at that fertilizer plant, Dr. Shafi's experience, Michelle seeing just where she's working in the environmental sciences and with water. you really start to see how so much of this kind of knowledge, and what I've tried to work with is, this frame of insurgent knowledge, almost. And so I really do appreciate you all sharing that and giving us that context of how you all got started. And yeah, Mr. Mitchell kind of got us started on my next question of where I wanted to go. Um, and so maybe we'll turn to Michelle. Um, how are you then seeing, how are things developing within the environmental justice and climate justice movement? You kind of gave us a little bit of the history of where things have been. Where are you at now, and how are you seeing things kind of develop?
Well, first of all, for us, there is no difference or disconnect. For us, environmental justice is climate justice, and climate justice is environmental justice. And economic justice is the thread that runs throughout it all. When we look at historically the ways in which our communities manifested themselves, not just blacks, but our native native peoples, our Asian Pacific Islander, Latino families. When we think about the migrations of many and the atrocities that impacted many of them, they were actually placed in spaces at that particular time that was not conducive to being able to really live functionally and habitably, right? And so they were placed in some spaces that were considered dangerous spaces. And we see that today with sea level rise, the path of hurricanes and storms and things of that nature. For us, environmental justice is where we live, work, worship, pray, and go to school. And so we have been working, as you shared, with the demographic data works that we do with the Environmental Justice Health Alliance. We have worked with many of our communities in making those connections between everything from that of the most egregious industrial chemical operations to that of equally market based chemicals, where we see products in dollar stores and things of these nature. So our communities are the host and homes for all of these things. And so pulling back those layers, as you heard Harold speak to, those emissions that were impacting certain parts of health. For us, this is why when we talk about the climate crisis and solutions for the climate crisis, we can't just look at a particular emission like the element of carbon and think we will shop our way through buying carbon credits or whatever you hear people speak to. You hear from our communities that we need to address all of the emissions. When we say all of the emissions, these are the pollutants and the degradation that is happening to the atmosphere, the water, and the soils and land, but it is equally impacting our very existence and our health. And so by not having those connections and by not forcibly having the connection to health that extends way back to that of slavery and brings us through into Jim Crow, racial segregation, and the likes thereof, we hear today constantly over and over and over again that it is the lifestyle of the people. Well, yes and no, because the laws permitted these things. So, what we do is work with our communities to educate, empower, as you heard Harold say, educate and empower and help to build the power within those communities for them to provide the solutions that's necessary and needed. And that's what brought us into what we call the Equitable and Just Climate platform. Many of us, all of us on this panel, have contributed to that process and see the viability that will help for us to really be able to reach across this nation and really drop and talk with and speak with and build and hear from those folks who are deeply most impacted. It's not just about the polar bear, right? It is about how it deeply impacts our daily living. We are still striving for that beloved community. And so, with that, we make sure that we've created a platform with 13 planks that which should make sure that we leave no one behind. But I'll just leave it here. This is why it's so important to be in a space where we are today with folks like you, Chaz, and our political science folks, because we know our own stories. The Philadelphia story came from Brother Du Bois. It didn't come from some environmental conservationist. But that Philadelphia story is as relevant today as it was from the day he penned that, especially when we think about COVID-19 and the fact that we don't have access to clean drinking water. We don't have access to water to wash our hands. We look at what happened in Texas the other week with the disaster that they had there with the freeze crisis. And you know what we fail to realize is that people are still without water today in Texas. So these are the connections that we need to be making and that we need from organizations like yours to help us to be able to better help our communities, like you heard Harold say, even better help the policymakers, even better support. And I think equally, Dr. Shafi, that also will bring the funding sources that we need for us to be the authors of our own stories and our solutions. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Shafi, do you want to take on a bit of this conversation?
Yes, thank you. Michelle hit all the right points. And as far as the connection between EJ and climate justice, as Michelle said, we don't think there is any really distinction between the two. It is well the continuation of both. And I want to invoke what Toni Morrison said in her speech in 1975. And I think the glue that connects the two is racism, where she talked about the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you from, it keeps you keep explaining over and over again your reason for being. And that is what happens in EJ community. I've been engaged in this kind of forum for over 3 decades. And what we see in EJ communities, many forums, as Harold knows and Michelle knows, is that we go there and we hear testimonies over and over from communities there, from Mossville, Louisiana, Fort Valley, Georgia, Charleston, West Virginia, Aiken, South Carolina, Wilmington, uh, Delaware, Manchester, Texas, and many, many more that I'm not, I don't have time to go to, is that they are telling their stories, but they are never given a chance or opportunities or the resources to do the work to address this environmental racism that they are living with it and under its threat. As Michelle said, when we talk about environmental justice, we really are different from the mainstream environmental movement because we really expand the boundaries of environment. We are not talking about just spotted owl. We care about them. We care about polar bear, but we think more like in terms of the fact that all communities are not created equal, as Dr. Bullard said. And we think about environment in terms of where we work, where we play, where we study, where we worship, and where and what and how we eat. All of this we consider an environment and part of our environment. And we also, when we talk about environmental justice movement and climate justice movement, we really are seeing three streams coming together and forming a river. It is the merging of civil rights movement, economic social justice movement, and environmental movement, because without bringing those, it's really not going to be as important because in real world, nothing happens in silo. Nothing happens in vacuum. And, these are all issues that need to be taken together in order to address the issue. And we see that with the environmental racism, with climate, we see that zip code really the most accurate predictor of people's health, well-being, both economic and health-wise. And as Hot Secretary, Deputy Secretary decades ago said, zip code should be an address, not a lifetime health determinants. And when we talk about climate change, we really, if we reduce it to just global warming issue, then there will be a problem. Because if we don't frame the issue right, we end up with wrong solutions. The problem is greenhouse gases. We need to really reduce that, and all our problems are going to be solved. So let's engage in emission trading as a solution, and then we come up with these wrong fixes, wrong solutions that really would not address our problem. I know that many view climate change as a defining human development challenge of the new millennium, and define it in terms of rising sea level, the flood, and hurricane. We have witnessed all these weather events, and we really know that climate change impacts everybody, whether the country is poor or rich. Nobody is immune from the adverse impact of climate change. But what happens is that the risk associated with the climate change is not really, the risks are not uniform. And the threats of climate change do not really operate in a silo independent of other vulnerability. As we see, the poorest countries are worst affected. The low income and communities of color are disproportionately impacted. And so we see the entrenched inequity of climate change is really a poster child of displaced hardship. And the worst effect is likely to fall on the shoulder of very people who really were responsible for causing the global warming. If you look at the ecological footprint, you see that the very people who were responsible for creating it are very much the least vulnerable to the impact. And as far as I think 2007, Desmond Tutu called the disparity in terms of effect of climate shocks and vulnerability, and he called it the adaptation apartheid. Because when you look at it, we see that the very people that were impacted and continue to be impacted are the least able to mitigate, to adapt to the shocks of climate change. And to view climate change as an environmental issue is really a disservice. It's a human rights issue. It's a socio-economic issue. And And I think that if you look at the convergence of all these vulnerabilities or threats, that I think not long ago, we are still in the midst of it, the pandemic toll on community, we saw that there was a link between that and the disproportionate number, because the Harvard study showed that only exposure to particulate matter 2.5 could increase the mortality of the victims who have been exposed to COVID. And we know the particulate matter 2.5 is only one of the pollutant in many of these EJ communities. So as I said, we see all this convergence of all these threats, and we know that it is really connected. We know that climate, virus, they really don't know anything about race, ethnicity, but I think that the centuries of really fully blind policies, practices have subjugated the Black, Brown, Indigenous communities and low-income communities to this state of affair where we see the disparities in health, wealth, education, and we see that this whole exposure from cradle to grave has really taken its toll on the communities. And new studies are showing that not just the disproportionate impact of exposure to the pollutant when you live, but also they say that even when before the baby is born, it could potentially impact. So I really don't want to just connect the dots because that's too loose for me. I think that we really need to stitch these pieces together. We need to look at the forest, not just one tree. We need to learn to stitch not just these pieces, but also time travel, past, present, and future. And I think that if you look at the link from the past, like redlining, now the studies show that the redlining has connection with how that a couple of degree of higher temperature in the communities that were redlined. We see that I can go on about, these are studies that have been done in 108 cities that showed that there was an elevation of temperature, uh, higher temperature in communities that had the history of redlining. And yes, it's good to think about, short-term solution like for COVID, short social distancing, shelter in place. These are good short-term, but we really need to think about the baseline of the vulnerability that makes us susceptible to all of this, and the toxic legacy of environmental racism that has created this baseline. I'm going to stop. I just realized I went too far. Sorry,
No
my
worries.
apologies. I think all of us EJ folks, we are like, preachers. We can go on.
Yes. I think we're all like, preachers by trade. So you are among family. Um, Looking at the time, because it is my job to kind of regulate time, with about 14 minutes. So I'm gonna ask, kind of move us to kind of our last prompt, our last kind of position. Because you have given us like a lot to chew on. And kind of, yeah, I think a lot. I think speaking of the convergences of these movements and of justice is something that I'm particularly interested in. But I'm wondering how we move forward. I think a lot of times we have some of these conversations, and so I'm wondering, um, when we had our kind of like pre-talk, before we got to the panel, you know, what are some opportunities? How do we get? How do we not get lost in contradictions? And how do we move beyond the moment? And how do we strategize? I think if each of you can just maybe take, maybe a couple minutes, we'll say 2 to 3, give me like your hot take, of some changes, opportunities you see. How do we not get lost in contradictions, and how do we strategize? And we'll start with Mr. Mitchell first.
I think, let me go back. I mean, a lot of this is basically on policy. And as Michelle stated, there is no difference of environmental justice, economic justice, climate justice. The problem is when you put the word justice on there, those decision makers are the ones that need to be held accountable. But this goes back to racism and race. When you see environmental justice and waste and facility sightings in these communities of color, the studies, I mean, we've been studied to death. So it's all there where it shows that these facilities are put in Black and brown communities. So this whole thing of the plantation capitalism control, and until we deal with the policymakers and the decision makers on that side, where I'm, glad to, as far as talking about the political science piece, but this is where we have to get engaged right here. And that's where we've been away. And it's kind of like what got us moving in our project in Spartanburg. So I was able to just think about the fact that Jim Clyburn did his student teaching in our community. And when I began to plug some of the folks in the community to remind him, and going to Jim had just become the Congressional Black Caucus chair. So pulling my other member, our senator then, a US senator, my center when I was playing football, he was the chief of staff for Fritz Hollings. So we began to look at that political structure. The power is there. And what we have forgot is that where the Constitution says we the people, that's what it means. We the people, not the politicians, not the industry folks, not all these other folks. It's the people. And we've gotten confused about the power. The power is within us. And that's where, as Michelle stated, that equitable and just platform, the members there, Michelle, myself, and others, met with the National Black Caucus of state legislators back in 2019. We sat down and met with those folks and began to articulate and show where they didn't even realize that they were rubber stamping bad decisions and policies that was impacting us, the people that they represent. They had no idea. They didn't connect. And forgive me, Dr. Shafi, when you're talking about connecting the dots, they didn't connect it. They didn't see, and then they didn't know a lot of these strong EJ leaders. So if you look at the other side, on the Republican side, they have ALEC, they have the Heritage Foundation, they have their think tank. But on our side, we don't have anything to hold anybody accountable or to put on the plate to go to the elected officials to say, hey, this is what we want you to do. And so that's when we met, back then. And it was a thing where it's like, wait a minute, this is a presidential cycle. These candidates are going to be coming through asking for the endorsements of the House members and the senators. But guess what? NAACP and others that talk about criminal justice, they're going to talk about that. Everybody else has an item for members and elected officials to talk about, but the EJ community and folks in the climate movement, nobody's told any of these folks to do anything. So in this whole cycle that we had, pushing first Jay Inslee, who took the platform, and it became like the gold standard, then all of a sudden everybody jumped on. It was only until our members met with NBCSL that we created the first forum on environmental justice at, forgive me, Michelle, South Carolina State University in Orangeburg, South Carolina. But when that took place, Corey participated, Elizabeth Warren, and Tom Steyer. And we had some of the other candidates that dropped out, but our current president didn't participate. But he saw, as those debates and the cycle went forward, it was somebody put in the chat about the politics being local, but it's the local where that rises up. You rise from the local, state to the federal level. We have to understand our power and civics. And that's where it makes the difference. Because if you have somebody that is pushing, say for instance, like when I'll just say that when Trump put out the opportunity zones,
I'm gonna hold you up right there. I'm gonna hold you up real quick. because we got like 8 minutes. But I'm gonna hold you to that. Let's get information, right? Like if I hear anything, we have got to get information. And yeah, and thank you so much, I think, for your example, right? Because this was a way of taking somewhere like, again, in the South is where all politics really comes from, right? And so taking that position, and really pressing, as you're pointing us to, political structure, political candidates, right? To really get something done. So yeah, I want to ashe and affirm you, but also lift up the chat as well. Yeah, let's get going. Michelle, you
I'm
wanna?
going to make mine very quick. This is taking action time. I want everyone to go to ajustclimate.org. Ajustclimate.org. I want you to sign in your name, your organization, and your state, and so that you can get more information. And if you and equally we can get the information from you as well, Chaz. We want to actually, we hope to see all of your whole organization signed up, because we need all of you. And then we already have the information that we need, and then you all can take that to your folks and reach out to us and say, hey, we're here to help you. What can we do? That's all we need. Together, we can build power and move it. Go to ajustclimate.org, sign up. We have the plan. And if you notice, the plan will match the Biden plan. That way, we can talk about what we need for our communities. Thank you for this opportunity.
Ashe, Ashe. Thank you. Dr. Shafi, do you want to give us, yeah, I know, we talked about, yeah, Biden's 40% plan coming. There's a lot that we had set up for this conversation, but how do we strategize? How do we not get lost in contradictions? And Dr. Shafi, what are some opportunities, if you want to speak to the current political terrain? What do you see as kind of like our marching orders from here?
I think one of the positive things that I saw as a good start was when on May 20th, 2019, Milwaukee County had declared a resolution and called racism a public health crisis. And I think that was a good start, because we see underlining all of these, the common thread is racism in this country. And there are lots of positive things that are happening, which is refreshing, because after Trump administration made climate change a scarlet letter and forced federal agencies to take it off their website. And uh, I think he I think he rolled back 100 environmental protection laws. He drastically altered the NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, which really the biggest provision that was helping under the executive order of President Clinton, the 12898, as a legal tool to help communities fight back environmental racism. It's refreshing. We see a lot of positive points out there. One is that for the first time, the US Congress House Select Committee was released a climate report, which is the Congressional Action Plan for Clean Energy, Economy, and a Healthy, Resilient, Just America, that was released on June 30, 2020, sorry. And the biggest thrill I got, I know it's not really a big part of that, but from page 300 to 312, it was devoted to environmental justice. That was a first to see, first of all, Congress go on record and create a climate report, and the second, to have EJ as part of that. and hopefully we can hold their feet to the fire. And equally elating is the EJ for All that is being reintroduced, I think, by the House Committee's chair on House Committee on Natural Resources chair, Raul Grijalva, and Representative Donald McKitchen, and Michelle has been very much involved. I think she was on a couple of panels that they had when they took EJ for All on a road show to different EJ community in Cancer Alley and in different parts. So I'm really excited about that because I see some traction. This HR 5986 is the first that we see that is talking about EJ. I know that we had first EJ uh, bill proposed by John Lewis in the 90s, very modest EJ, but never passed, or in the Senate, it was introduced by Al Gore. And we see also other things like Michelle has been heavily involved in that with the cumulative impact legislation that just passed in New Jersey. That's very promising, because one of the things in environmental justice is that most of these pollutants are regulated as if we are being exposed to one of them and not really multiple pollutant and over time. Legislation like cumulative impact is very important. And I think that one of the things that that NEPA, the National Environmental Justice, National Environmental Policy, which is the most comprehensive laws that passed in 1970, was trying to be gutted by Trump administration, was the cumulative impact part of it, which is, I'm going to stop. I can.
Thank you all so much. We are right at time. But yeah, again, I want to thank all of you. And if I can just kind of summarize all the things that I heard of accountability, right? Getting information, organizing, right? But also working, and when, recognition and accountability meets organization on the other side, and I think using that as a crux of this moment. Thank you all. Thank you everyone who joined on the Zoom. If you all, the panelists, were able to read the chat, everyone in the chat is just thanking you all for this opportunity and for sharing so much of your information. Anyone wants to reach out to me and I can connect you with the panelists, I will definitely do that. Again, my name is Chaz Briscoe. I think coming up next on the schedule is the Founders Symposium. So I want to definitely also recommend that conference attendees check out some of the next panels, the Founders Symposium, and then the President's Reception at 7:30. Thank you all, and please enjoy the rest of your Friday.
Thank you. Chaz, you did an amazing job, and I'm sorry that you had to deal with this loss, and I know that
It's okay.
not